My topic is perspectives on death, which is an interesting topic to present in a hospital because, as we all understand, a hospital is committed to the preservation of life. It's interesting that the roles one finds oneself in a hospital require that you fulfill that commitment to the preservation of life. What that role entails with regard to your attitude towards death, however, is another matter. And very often we sometimes mass together the idea that preservation of life must see death, therefore, as a failure or as the enemy or as loss. And that is a very common predicament in the medical community. It's interesting that you live out here in this beautiful country where you watch the seasons change, and you don't feel it's a failure of the tree when it drops its leaves, and you don't feel it's a failure of the tree when it grows old and it falls over and it turns back into the earth and nurtures future trees. You have a sense of the continuity of nature. But there is some way in which the role of the medical community starts to find itself pitted against a certain kind of rhythm of life and death, a certain kind of appropriateness or harmony in the way of things. And it's raising, especially now with technology developing as it is, a number of ethical and moral issues, but also issues, I think, that are internal problems for the medical community in terms of frustration, in terms of really burnout, I think. I'd like to reflect about that issue a little bit with you today. I arrived at this interest in this issue in a somewhat backdoor way, not as a psychologist particularly, but as a spiritual seeker who had gone to India. In the course of my studies over there, I began to see that people in different cultures, different religious traditions, had a different philosophical underpinning about the meaning of a life and thus the meaning of a death. And they were able to see life and death as part of a process in which death had its own harmony. And I even realized that in the East, in the more intense religious traditions, among the Buddhist monks, for example, they saw life as a preparation for the moment of death. Now, we don't see that at all here. We see that death, because we are living in what is primarily, even though most of us have had some religious training and we give at least lip service and some heart service to Christianity or to whatever religious tradition we have, we still are primarily philosophical materialists. That when you are dead, you're dead. And we say, well, it's a mystery beyond that. But we are not very deeply rooted in the sense of the continuity of spirit, of continuity of soul. And when you come to a tradition in which the dominant theme is the continuity of awareness before birth and after death, the meaning of a life and death is quite different. And the way in which one approaches death is very different. The experience that I had that was very dramatic for me was when I first went to India. I had the Western model pretty much, even though I'd had these experiences of a sense of the awareness independent of body. I went to Benares, which is known as the city of dying in India. It's one of the most sacred cities in India, and there on the streets are many lepers, people with advanced cancer, people with huge goiters, with all kinds of problems, often with just a loincloth, enough money on their loincloth for the wood for their funeral pyre, and a begging bowl. And I was walking through the streets with my American Express traveler's checks, and with a sense of pity, with a sense of the horrendous nature which you feel often when you're in India about the economics, about the starvation, about all of that. And as a Westerner would say, gee, this place is in terrible shape. We ought to do something about it. Somebody ought to do something about it. I was so pained by it that I went back to my hotel. I didn't even want to stay on the streets. It was just too painful to think about these people. Shortly thereafter, I met my spiritual teacher, and I ended up spending the winter in a temple in India. And I became steeped in the philosophy and the religious stance of the people. And when I came back about 5-6 months later to Benares again, I walked down the street with an entirely different perceptual stance regarding what was going on, because I realized that these people had come from all over India in order to die in Benares. To die in Benares and get burned by the Ganges River in Benares is the most auspicious thing a Hindu person can do. It assures that they are liberated at that moment. It's such a deep belief system that when I had quieted down through this training, I looked into their eyes, which I had averted my gaze before. I looked into their eyes, and I saw them looking back at me in a completely calm and present way. And in fact, some of them were looking at me with pity. And at first, that shook me until I realized they saw me as somebody who was confused, wandering around the world, somewhat lost in what my life was about, while they knew exactly what their life was about, and they were at home, and they were perfectly centered and structured in their life. And I began to see that the philosophical stance a person had affected very dramatically how they met their death and how they approached their death. And I further saw, as I studied Buddhism, I noticed that, for example, the Theravadan Buddhists, the monks are given meditations in which, in the old days, the bodies of Buddhists were thrown into the cemetery and they were eaten by the birds. And the monks were usually sent to the cemetery for nights, all night, to sit and meditate on the decaying body, on the fly-infested corpse, on the bloated body, on the skeleton. And they did these meditations in order to, in a way, loosen their attachment to the body and to see the ephemeral or changing nature of the body. The purpose was to let go of the attachment to the concept of life as the body, so that they would keep their consciousness right in the moment. And so the dying process, instead of being filled with "I'm dying" or "don't let me die," they would merely be attentive to the moment as each process unfolded in the moment. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, the monk is trained to notice exactly the processes that are going on at the moment of dying. Not to be drugged into unconsciousness, but to stay very, very clear. And for example, they notice in their system, they notice as the earth element changes, they feel the heaviness and they note heaviness. As the water element leaves, they note dryness and they note it as dryness. They keep their consciousness focused on just what's happening at the moment. As they say, as the fire element leaves, they notice coldness. And as the air element leaves, they notice the out-breath as longer than the in-breath. In other words, they watch the processes of death. And instead of coming back into their minds of "I'm dying," which is a thought away from where the action is, they stay right with the process itself as it's going. And you find that a lot of the anxiety and a lot of the struggle has to do with the concept that the person has about what's happening. Not what's happening, not the dying process itself. I mean, many of us, I've worked with many, many people, as I'm sure most of you have, as the moment that they die. Some of them are struggling terribly hard because they have a model in themselves that this is loss and failure that's terribly frightening. And yet I'm sure many of you have been present with people who die where there is a release, an opening, a letting go, a feeling of rightness, of just tuning, of support, which often leaves the doctor and the nurse feeling privileged to be present or feeling grace to be part of this somewhat mysterious process in which this transformation occurred, with there is living spirit and suddenly the body is dead and there's no spirit there and something has gone and it stays right at the edge of the unknown. I saw that in the East there was such a lightness about death. I mean, there are Zen poems like a Zen master is dying and he's supposed to write a poem before he dies. That's what Zen masters do. And his students came up and they said, "You haven't written your poem." And he says, "Oh my goodness, hand me my quill." And he calligraphies. And it says, "Birth is thus, death is thus, verse on no verse, what's the fuss?" Which I always thought should be followed by Burma shave, but it sounded like another monk who they brought him his favorite cake as he was dying, and then they leaned over to hear his final mystical words, and his final mystical words is, "My, this cake is good." And Ramana Maharshi, the Indian saint, who was dying, and his devotees were crying and said, "Don't leave us, don't leave us." And he looked confused. He said, "Don't be silly. Where could I go? I'm just dropping my body." Now, the term dropping the body is an Indian concept. It says that who I am is not what's dying. I am just dropping, I'm selling my Ford, in effect. No, don't sell your Ford. Don't sell your Ford, you see. Now, in a way, it shifts the nature of the experience of dying, because at that point, the minute you identify with some component in yourself which is not that which dies, you then approach death as a transformational experience rather than an ending experience. It's no different than puberty. I mean, you can imagine collecting baseball cards and then coming into puberty, and you say, "I'm never going to give up these baseball cards." And then a moment later, they're quite irrelevant, just because of something happened in your endocrine system, and your whole psyche changed. Well, roughly, this is the way death is seen, is just seen as a transition. You understand, it's based on the recognition, which has to come ultimately through some direct experience, the recognition that you are more than your physical body. That doesn't cover all of it. And a lot of that thought process has been relegated to the church and relegated to a Sunday morning or an interesting thought. But when you come into the medical community, you continually identify the body with the person. Now, we made one leap when we went from treating the ultimate in dying, seeing that as the ICU as the best place to die, in which the body was treated as the major focus, and the psychology was treated as somewhat irrelevant. We won't have any dogs and cats and children in here because it will upset the medical support system. Then we moved to hospice started to become a thought in the world, coming from Cecily Saunders and St. Christopher's in England, and it came over, and it slowly come through work of people like Elizabeth Ross. The whole idea that there was a psychological individual that was dying, and could we create a support system to make that a little less painful for the psychological person by giving them a support system, helping them often to die at home among loved ones, giving them some feeling of control, of psychological control, or even in intensive care units, bringing in more warmth and more human, in other words, honoring the psychology as well as preserving the body. Now, that's a shift in focus and in emphasis in the medical community. And that's happened reasonably painlessly in a very few years, by the way, in this culture. But the work I'm interested in goes one step further than that, because it's really focused on the, if you will, a spiritual awareness of an individual. Because I saw that the people in the East, at least the most evolved ones, saw their death as a transformation, and they saw it as a vehicle through which they could awaken more out of that identification. They could break the identification through the process of watching their own death and staying in an environment where other people were not, if you will, sucking them in or catching them in the identification with their body. So I decided to set up a Benares of the West, so to speak, and I set up a thing which I, without euphemism, just called the Dying Center. And the Dying Center was a place where people could come who wished to use their dying process as a vehicle for deepening their spiritual understanding of their own identity. That is, loosening the hold of identification with their body through the process of dying. Now, who's going to staff that? Because what you're trying to do is put that person, that patient, in an environment in which the people around that person are not going to keep catching them in the drama of dying, because the drama of dying is the biggest drama going in town. I mean, it sucks everybody in. There's hardly anybody that doesn't get caught in that one. You may stay very, very calm until it comes to the moment of dying, and then everybody's around. I was with teaching with Elizabeth Ross, and there was a 28-year-old nurse. Since she had been 6 years old, she'd been having operations for cancer. There were dozens of operations. She had 3 or 4 children. She was now 29 or 30. She's been a very active woman. She was a nurse, and she was often in the hospital as a patient. And she said to us as the group, "What would you feel like if you came to visit me?" And then Elizabeth wrote on the board all the answers, and people said things like, "I would feel angry at the universe for having put you through this. I would feel pity. I would feel," and a whole set of emotional reactions to the fact that this woman was in this condition. And she says, "Do you see my predicament?" She said, "Nobody was with me. Everybody was with my symbolic identity. Everybody saw a 28-year-old nurse with 3 or 4 children who was dying of cancer. And I was completely in here screaming, 'Is anybody out there? Does anybody hear me?' Because nobody was with me as a fellow human being, because my symbolic value was so powerful." Do you hear that issue at all? When somebody is very, very famous or very, very powerful or very rich or very beautiful in the culture, they are really at an interesting disadvantage. It's very hard for them to make real connections with people because people are so awed by this symbolic value. And people keep responding to the symbol and don't let them in as fellow human beings. And people starve often, emotionally starve. So we decide in the Dying Center to people it with people like me, because I am somebody who wants to spiritually awaken, and I realize that the thing that keeps people most asleep in spiritual life is their identity with their separateness and their fear of death, therefore. And therefore, if I really want to awaken, I want to push myself as hard as I can, and the thing that's going to push my buttons the most as a human being is to be in the presence of dying. So that I would like to be around dying people as work on myself. The dying people come to use their dying as work on themselves. In other words, we are creating a monastery or an ashram in which all the people are there in order to awaken, and the vehicle that they're working with is the dying process. In other words, instead of the focus being on stopping the dying or anything, the focus is on awakening. Now, what happened, of course, was that people came to the Dying Center, and it was such a nice place to be, they didn't die. And, you can't make people promise to die, and you've only got so many beds, and so we had to change the title to the Living Dying Center, because we were faced with this problem.